right, today we're going to talk about the plants. This is our next kingdom of living organisms that we're going to discuss. So we started last week looking at bacteria, which are the simplest forms of life, and then looked at the protists, and protists can be multicellular or single cell organisms. And now we're going to move into the plants. So we're moving up on our level of complication in terms of having more ability, more complexity and structure. And there's just lots and lots of diversity when we look at the plants. So this is chapters 23 through 27 in your textbook. We're going to spend most of our time in chapter 24, actually, looking at just basic structures of plants and how they work. So basic definition of plants, they are multicellular photosynthetic eukaryotes. So that means that these cells all contain a nucleus and they contain membrane-bound organelles. And the key organelle that plants have are chloroplasts, and that's where photosynthesis occurs, is inside the chloroplast. We learned about that earlier in the semester when we studied photosynthesis. So that's taking that sunlight, that radiant energy from the sun, that UV light, and converting it into carbohydrate within the chloroplast. So that's the function of plants. Its primary function is photosynthesis, but they do also undergo cellular respiration. So they use those carbohydrates produced by photosynthesis for growth and energy, just like any other organism. So again, many are multicellular, composed of many cells, and those cells sometimes have different functions, and we'll talk about those. So being able to live on land is a key adaptation of plants, so they don't require life in the water like we saw with the algae in the kingdom or in the protists. So these can live on land away from water, and the benefit of a land environment is there's lots of light out on the surface, and carbon dioxide is present in higher concentrations in the air than in the water, so that allows for good photosynthesis, because we know carbon dioxide is a key reactant, necessary component of photosynthesis. So we find that much higher in the air than in the water. So when we look at some of the issues with being on land, well, obviously, if there's not enough rainfall, then plants are at threat for drying out. We call that desiccation. Something that is desiccated is dried out and has no water. So like when you're making beef jerky, for example, you're desiccating that meat, and that lack of water and high salt concentration prevents that beef jerky from rotting, right, and going bad. So anyway, that threat of drying out is a problem, but they have protections because of that, like the seeds that are dispersed, by the wind are protected by a seed coat, a hard protein-covered coat to prevent the contents of that seed from drying out. When we look at what the water provided, when we look at what plants that survive in water, for example, your submerged plants, that gives them nice support. They never dry out. They have, good sturdiness. Those stems are upright and, able to be full of water. That water vacuole we're going to talk about, are present and full of water, but not in the case of land plants that don't have access to water. They tend to droop, right? If you don't water your plant, that stem kind of flops over because those water vacuoles don't contain enough water for support. So to keep that water inside the plant, so it comes in through the roots, up the stem, out to the leaves, the plant is covered by a waxy cuticle. So this waxy covering prevents water loss, and that's really important for our leaves to be covered with this waxy cuticle to prevent water loss and drying out. So that's key structure to live on land. And also the vascular system, which are these vessels that run up the stem from the roots, help to transport that water from the roots to the leaves. We'll talk about that. And plants evolved from green algae, which are a protist, about 450 million years ago. So that waxy cuticle, like we said, prevents that water loss. There's also openings in the bottom surface of the leaf called stomata, and that allows air in to allow for that gas exchange. So carbon dioxide can enter the plant through the stomata and oxygen can leave the plant from the stomata. We'll talk more about that. And then there's special tissue called apical tissue that can undergo mitosis to allow growth and specialization within the root. We'll talk more about that. So again, if we look at a plant leaf, this is kind of a cross-section of that leaf. We can see that waxy cuticle is stained orange. We find that on the top surface of the leaf. And then the stomata, if we look at the look at the surface of a leaf, we see these little openings here on the surface. Actually, it's on the underside of the leaf for gas exchange. So we're going to focus in on these in a little bit. So leaves have the cuticle and the stomata. Again, just understanding the function of those structures. The stomata is for gas exchange, and the cuticle is to prevent water loss in that leaf. We have different groups of plants. The gymnosperms are your pine trees. So when you think of gymnosperms, think of plants that produce cones. So the seeds are not enclosed by a fruit. The seeds are actually within the leaves of the cones, and they're called scales actually. And we'll go a little bit into detail, not too much into the different groups, but just so you understand, the gymnosperms, are your familiar conifers, which are your pine trees that produce cones. So that's kind of the key feature of the conifers. So they have those pine cones where the leaves or the seeds are maintained. So when we look at the leaves of pine trees, they're very tough, needle-like, kind of pokey, right? So they have a very thick cuticle, and that helps them survive in dry environments. You see lots of pine trees in sandy areas, and they can also survive the winter, right, because of those tough leaves that conserve water. So when we look at angiosperms, that's another group. Those are the flowering plants. Those seeds are enclosed by a fruit. So any kind of leafy tree you see out in your yard that loses its leaves and gets new leaves in the spring, those are the flowering plants. Those are the angiosperms. We'll talk about those. Those are the most complex. When we look at the angiosperms, there's two groups. There's the monocots and the dicots. And the monocots have special characteristics that identify them as monocots. When we look at the seed, they're like a single seed. For example, if you look at a corn seed, it's just one single seed. You can't split that seed into two parts. But if I look at, say, a bean plant, I can split that seed into two pieces. If I look at a peanut plant, I can split a peanut into two pieces. Those are examples of dicots. So they have two cotyledons. So these cotyledons are these special fleshy-like structures that provide nutrition to the plant, to the growing embryo inside. So cotyledon, we have one in monocots and two in dicots. So if you look at a generalized flower structure, you do need to know the different structures. There's the female and the male parts of the flower. So some flowers are purely female, some are purely male, and others are mixed of male and female parts within the same flower. For example, this particular flower has male and female parts. The female part is shown here. We have the stigma, which receives the pollen from the male part of the plant, and that pollen goes down the pollen tube, which is in the neck of this structure, which we call the style. So the stigma is the surface, which is sticky, receives the seed, receives the pollen from the male, and then that travels down the style into the ovary, into the ovule, and this is the female part of the plant. This is the nucleus that will combine with the nucleus of the pollen grain to form the new plant. Down the pollen tube, which is in the neck of this structure, which we call the style. So the stigma is the surface, which is sticky, receives the seed, receives the pollen from the male, and then that travels down the style into the ovary, into the ovule, and this is the female part of the plant. This is the nucleus that will combine with the nucleus of the pollen grain to form the new plant. So, or the mature seed. So the anther and the filament, this is the male part of the plant. This makes up the stamen. So the whole structure here is called the stamen. The filament is this stalk-like structure, and the tip is the anther. And this contains the pollen. So this is the pollen that will travel to the stigma, come down the style into the ovary and meet up with the ovule to combine to form the mature embryo. So the flowers, the petals of the flower, we just call the petal or the corolla. And then the part that supports the flower, we have these small green leaves at the base of the flower. These are called the sepals. So these are small leaf-like structures that support the flower. We call them the sepal. So those are parts of a flowering plant. So when you look at flowering plants, they all have a root, they have a stem, which and leaves, which make up the shoot. So this is above the ground, the root system is below the ground. And then we have these other parts that we're going to talk about. Sometimes the roots are modified into different structures called in stems, which are called tubers and corms. When you think of like potatoes and your different vegetables that grow below the ground, like a sweet potato, for example, ginger root. Those are very specialized structures of these vegetative organs, and we'll talk about some of those. So we have the roots that are below the ground, and then we have the stem, which then branches into the leaves. So when you look at just basic structures here, the root is where the water enters the plant. It's carried up the stem to the leaves, where the leaves use that water to conduct photosynthesis. And then the leaves undergo photosynthesis and they produce the carbohydrates and the food for the plant. And that food goes from the leaves down the stem to serve all parts of the plant. And some of that carbohydrate is stored within the roots of the plant. Again, if you think of a carrot, for example, that's an enlarged root that stores energy for the plant that was created up here in the leaves by photosynthesis. So we'll talk more about that as well. So the roots. Functions: absorbing water and minerals from the soil. They produce hormones for the plant that are necessary for growth. And it anchors the plant in the soil. We know that if we just try to take a stem and put it in the soil, there's nothing to hold that plant in place. So we need roots to anchor the plant in the soil. And the more those roots spread out in the soil, the sturdier that plant is in the soil. And then we have little hairs coming off the root, and that increases the absorption capacity of those roots so they can absorb more water and minerals with those little root hairs. Those are important little features. When we look at the stems, that is just separates the roots from the leaves, allows that stem, grows and allows the leaves to get lots and lots of exposure to the sunlight. So as that stem grows taller, it puts it higher above the ground to get good access to sunlight. And it has this special tissue within it, vascular tissue, like our blood vessels are, the vascular system of our body. We're transporting water from the roots up to the leaves. And there's also a vascular tissue for the food produced in the leaves to go down the stem into the roots. So it's kind of a two-way highway for food and water within that stem. And like we said, the leaves are where photosynthesis occurs. So we need to expose the leaves to sunlight and have a nice broad leaf to trap that sunlight and turn that into oxygen and carbohydrate. So when you look at, parts of the leaves, the petiole is the tiny little stalk that attaches the leaf to the stem, and the blade is the wide portion where that photosynthesis occurs. So we talked about monocots and dicots. Again, this is just some features we see of monocots and dicots. We see just one seed, one cotyledon where that embryo is inside. This is like a peanut or a bean. There's two cotyledons, so that's a dicot. When we look at the root, if we do a cross-section of the root of a monocot, we can see the vascular tissue. The vascular tissue is xylem and phloem. Xylem transports water, phloem transports food for the plant. So you can think of phloem starts with that F sound and food starts with an F sound. So phloem is for food transport. These are just passageways within the stem and the root, and xylem transports water from the root to the stem to the leaves. So if I do a cross-section of the root, I can see the xylem and the phloem are in a ringed structure. But if I look in the dicots, I can see that the xylem is in this star-shaped structure. So I can identify the group of plants just based on looking at the cross-section of the root. And when I look in the stem, I can see the xylem and the phloem is in a ring structure in the stem, and then in the monocot, they're scattered throughout, but there is no real pattern of the xylem and phloem in the stem of the dicot. And then if I look at the leaves of the monocot versus the dicot, in the leaves, the veins all run parallel. They all run in the same direction. But in a dicot, they're branched. So the leaves have a netted pattern of those veins, and that gives it a distinct appearance. So think of what an oak tree and a maple tree looks like, right? Those leaves are kind of netted. They just kind of, those veins branch out in the leaf. But think of what a corn plant looks like. Corn, those veins all run in one direction. That makes it a monocot. And then if I'm looking at the flower of these plants, I find that the flowers are in groups of or multiples of 3. So if I look at this flower, I can count 6 petals. That would make it a monocot. It's in a group of 3. If I look at the dicots, they're in groups of 4 or 5. So here I can see this is a dicot because there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 petals on this flower. So these groups of flowering plants, monocots and dicots, have very distinct features, and we group them accordingly. We also find that the roots of monocots tend to be shallow, and dicots tend to be much deeper and hardier in the soil. So grass, for example, grass would be a monocot, because grass, if you look at a blade of grass, that's the leaf, right? Those veins all run in one parallel direction. So they have very shallow roots. They're good for holding soil. Like we see them along our highways. We see tall grasses being planted to keep that soil in place, because lots of shallow roots are good for preventing erosion. But the dicots have very deep roots. So big trees, for example, with large trunks and a lot of weight, those are going to be dicots, because those roots tend to travel deeper and are thicker and hold those plants in place. So talking about this vascular tissue, again, the xylem transports water and minerals from the roots to the leaves. So think of the direction that these are traveling. So we water the soil, and the water goes from the roots to the leaves to help with photosynthesis. Phloem transports those carbohydrates and any other compound produced by the plant, and that occurs in the leaves, because that's where photosynthesis occurs, and that goes from the leaves down to the roots. So when we look at this diagram, like I said, this is an example of a dicot. We can see the xylem is found in a star-shaped pattern, and then the phloem is around the outside, and it's blue. So the xylem, these are the tubes that carry the water from the root to the leaves through these open passageways you can see here. And then the phloem is the tissue that transport the carbohydrates and other organic molecules from the leaves down to the roots where they're stored. So the blue is the food transporting structure. So when you look at how roots are, they're very diverse. We can see a taproot here of a carrot. This is an example of a dicot. You can see that energy is stored in the root in the version of the carrot in that part, that taproot. It's called taproot. Turnips also are an example of something with a taproot. So we eat that and get the energy from that stored carbohydrate in this specialized root. But fibrous root systems we find are in grasses and corn. So they are a little more shallow, but they're really good at spreading out with these thin little roots, spreading out more shallow. So it's good in drier areas because they have access to water closer to the surface, and they're good at preventing erosion. So there's lots of different types of roots we might see. We're not going to go into detail on all these, but do know the difference between a taproot and its advantages, which is energy storage and anchoring deep into the soil, and fibrous root systems, which is good for absorbing water closer to the surface and holding the soil intact, like along hills and along the highways. We use grasses and fibrous root system plants, which are typically monocots, to keep the soil in place and preventing erosion. So looking at the structure of a leaf, we have these lots of different structures here that are quite important. So looking at how things are transported, I'm just going to show some basic layers here. So we have this waxy cuticle, which is the top layer. Remember, that's just for keeping water in, so the water doesn't escape from the leaf. This is a cross-section of the leaf here. And then we have this upper epidermis, which just provides support for the plant, the upper epidermis, and protection as well. And then we get to this Palisade Mesophyll. The Palisade Mesophyll are the cells where photosynthesis occurs. We can see there's a large water vacuole in there to keep the water ready and available. And then we have these chloroplasts scattered throughout. And we also have the other organelles of a plant cell, which aren't shown in this diagram. But this is where a majority of photosynthesis is occurring in the Palisade Mesophyll, in these individual cells, because we have the water right here within the cell that comes in by osmosis, again, from the other parts of the leaf through the stem from the roots, right? And then we have the spongy mesophyll. The spongy mesophyll, there's some photosynthesis that occurs here, but not as much as in the Palisade mesophyll. And the spongy mesophyll is called spongy because there's air spaces. There's holes among spaces between those cells where extra gases for photosynthesis can be stored. For example, carbon dioxide. As carbon dioxide is taken up by the leaf, it enters through these stomata, these passageways on the underside of the leaf. It's stored and hangs out in the air spaces of this spongy mesophyll layer. Then as the Palisade cells need carbon dioxide for photosynthesis, it simply diffuses from these air spaces into the Palisade cells where photosynthesis occurs. Also, as these cells produce oxygen as a result of photosynthesis, the oxygen diffuses out of these cells into the air spaces and then out through the stomata. So that's kind of the flow of gases. The carbon dioxide enters into the stomata through the air stored in the air spaces and goes into the Palisade cells for photosynthesis. And as they convert that to oxygen, the oxygen diffuses out of the Palisade cells into the air spaces and out the stomata into the air. So these are, kind of a very cool way that we have the leaf designed for maximal gas exchange with the environment. So we have the lower epidermis, which is just the supportive layer here again, and then again those stomata. So if we look at, this is a cross section, but if we look at it from a surface view, it just looks like these little holes here in the bottom of the plant. And the two pieces that make up the stomata, shown in orange here, these are called guard cells. So if I look at an enlarged version of a stoma, the stoma is the opening. So an opening is called a stoma. We see that, in other areas of biology as well. So the opening where the gases come and go is called the stoma. And the cells that control the size and the opening of the stoma are called guard cells. These too have chloroplasts in them. So there's a little bit of photosynthesis that can occur here as well. But again, a majority occurs in that Palisade layer. So we have these guard cells that can open and close this stoma depending on what the needs of the plant are. And again, we have this large central vacuole that stores water for the plant. And this all promotes and supports photosynthesis. And then we have these veins in the plants. Remember we said the veins are either parallel or netted. So these veins carry our xylem the tissues are xylem and phloem, and it carries the water. So the water is going to the leaf through the xylem, through this vessel, the red vessels, and then the sugars that are produced in this leaf by photosynthesis are transported through the phloem away from the leaf back down to the roots. So we have these veins scattered throughout the plant, throughout this spongy mesophyll layer for this transport of water and nutrients. So again, looking at gas exchange, that's occurring here. We also have water vapor that can exit the plant or enter the plant depending on the needs of the leaf and the water status of the leaf. So we have that exchange occurring through the stoma and then the veins like we already talked about. So this is what that xylem and phloem looks like. Again, it's just transporting water and food up and down the stem. Remember, xylem goes from the roots to the leaves for transport. That's what it's carrying water, right, from roots to leaves. And the phloem is carrying the sugars produced by the leaf down to the roots. So just these vessels, these veins carrying that important materials to the plant. And then we have these root hairs, we said, that are on the surface of the root out here, and water is absorbed by the root hairs through the root into the xylem where it's carried up to the leaves. So that's where the water enters, is through the roots. So we talked about these guard cells and how they control the opening and closing of the stomata. So potassium is an important ion that helps control the movement of water in and out of the stomata. So when we have water entering the stomata, it fills these vacuoles, plumps them up, and opens up the guard cell. So that's important. When we have good water availability, we have plump guard cells and good gas exchange. When water is low, we have, and potassium, we see more potassium outside the cell than inside the cell, then those vacuoles shrink and the stomata close. So the opening and closing of the stomata depends on the amount of water in those water vacuoles. And the more water inside, they're going to be open. Less water, they're going to be closed. So what determines that? Think in terms of, daylight and moisture. We find that stomata are open during the day when there's good opportunity for photosynthesis, lots of sunlight. These guard cells are full of water, and then at night they tend to close, and there's less photosynthesis occurring at nighttime. And again, if we have less water availability, the same thing occurs. Less photosynthesis, and the plant is going to die. So if we don't water our plants, those stomata stay closed, and there's poor gas exchange and photosynthesis ability of those plants. So we call, when a plant is nice and plump and upright, we call that turgor. And turgor depends on the amount of water inside those central vacuoles, making that plant plump and upright. So the cell wall is maximally stretched and plump when that central vacuole is full. So we say that this plant is turgid. If there is not enough water in the plant and it shrinks, then the plant starts to wilt. And if it gets really bad, we get something called plasmolysis. And plasmolysis is when the cell wall and the cell membrane separate from one another, and we have the shrinking of the cell to the point that the cells die. So if you've ever left a plant too long where it no longer can be revived with water, that means all those cells have undergone plasmolysis, and you're not going to get those plant cells back, and it's time to buy a new plant. So we have, just general wilting. This is okay. You add some water, and a couple hours later, it looks like this. That's great. Central vacuole is full of water again. But if this goes on too long, we get plasmolysis, which will lead to death of the plant. So we talked about the anatomy of the flower already. This has both male and female parts. Remember, this is the filament in the anther, or the stamen, and this is where the male part is. This is where we see the pollen produced. The pollen is the male portion. And then we have the stigma and the style. The stigma is where the pollen from the anther will travel to the stigma and then travel down to find the ovule, and that's where the egg and pollen grain combine to form the embryo of the new plant. So we see, obviously pollen will travel from one flower to a nearby flower. So sometimes we have fertilization within the flower, and other times we have fertilization among different flowers. So we have some diversity possible there. We talked about the sepals, or those supportive flowers, or leaves just below the flower. And then we have the stem, which is called the peduncle. That's the part that we have to pin onto our dress or suit when you go to prom or weddings, right? That's the tough part that we try to get that pin through without poking ourselves. But anyway, just understand the anatomy of a flower and kind of how the male and female parts work together to form that embryo that will be found down here inside the ovary. And I'll provide a short animation of that as well. So that concludes basic anatomy and function of the different tissues and parts of the plant kingdom.